As you know, the US is the top incarcerator in the world. And in the 80s, we really began to see our prison population boom. So we gotta wonder, why were so many people locked up in that decade? So there's a short, shallow answer to it. You ready? Drug and policing policies were established that were intentionally set up to harm black and brown drug users and sellers, but especially black users and sellers. But of course, that's the easy answer. There's a more nuanced, more truer answer. Let's explore that now. So many people were incarcerated in the 1980s for a lot of the same reasons why Africans were originally ripped from their land, brought to North America in the 1600s, and enslaved in this country until 1863. People in power regarded black people as mentally and morally inferior. There was power to be had, there was profits to be made, and there were deep-seated fears. And those fears justified the oppressive systems. But for the sake of this video, let's start in the 1960s. Despite what some people might lead you to believe, things in the US have always been turbulent. Side note, which is why the Make America Great Again slogan is such a powerful and honestly brilliant fable that allows us to look past grave injustices in the name of a booming economy. But the 1960s did see turbulence that our country hadn't quite seen before. There was a Cold War that made complete annihilation a daily possibility. There was a hot war in a far-off land that a lot of people didn't understand. There were social movements everywhere, and those movements were about things like anti-war, gay liberation, feminist and women's rights, fighting for our First Amendment rights, and making life more equitable for people with disabilities. And that's just to name a handful. And during that time, there were more major assassinations of highly visible and controversial civil rights leaders. There was Malcolm X, there's Martin Luther King Jr., there's Robert F. Kennedy, and his little brother, John. When JFK was murdered, his vice president took his place. It just so happened that his vice president was a masterful politician. He also happened to think that black and brown people were inferior to white people. His name was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, LBJ is remembered mostly for two things. One was lying his face off to Congress about the realities of the war in Vietnam. Okay, side note here, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, just type the Pentagon Papers into your favorite search engine, and we'll see you in a week. The second thing that LBJ was known for was being a giant on civil rights. Does he really deserve that reputation? The author Robert Dallek, I think, describes LBJ perfectly in the title of the biography that he wrote about the man, titled Flawed Giant. Look, we all got flaws, but Johnson had too many flaws to look past in order to consider him to be a true civil rights activist. LBJ didn't much like Asians, at one point referring to them as hordes of barbaric yellow dwarves. And he didn't much like black people. You can imagine what he called them. But for those involved with criminal justice reform, LBJ is mostly known for one thing: militarizing the police. In 1968, LBJ took his presidential pen and signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. This thing essentially paved the way for police departments to purchase military-grade weapons, machinery, and gear. And those, of course, were paid for by our tax dollars. Now, this happened way back in 1968, and it was bolstered by both Republicans and Democrats in the decades following. But we can still literally see the effects of this act today. Usually when we protest the killing of another unarmed black person in this country at the hands of law enforcement. It's incredible to me how this man's reputation is as a civil rights giant when his legacy screams something different. Alright, so after LBJ came RMN, and that's when things started to get kind of wild. Now obviously this guy isn't cool enough for you to recognize his initials, but you know his name, Richard Milhouse Nixon. And I'm positive that you felt the impact of the way that he saw the world. Because in June of 1971, Nixon declared a war on drugs, indicating that drug use was, quote, public enemy number one. Not poverty, not smoking, not international ideological conquests, not discrimination, not sexual harassment in the workplace, not racist policing tactics, not imprisoning political dissidents, not corrupt politicians, Watergate, but drugs. That's right, according to the leader of the free world, drugs were public enemy number one, and he was ready to incarcerate people for it. And to be straight up, like, this strategy is brilliant, because at the time, drug use, no matter how harmless, was associated with people like anti-war hippies, black people, brown people, and poor people. These types of people were really scary to the establishment. But at that point in time, overtly racist actions were practically political suicide for most people. Nixon and his people knew that there were a lot of people in the country who held racist ideologies but weren't willing to say it out loud anymore. And they also knew that if they put subtly racist options in front of the voters, that those people would vote for it. And this was the birth of what is called the Southern Strategy, which, when you boil it down to its bare essentials, means how to be racist without appearing racist. It's also a nice formal beginning for what we now refer to as dog whistling. So Nixon declared a war on drugs, but let's be clear about something. This was less of a war on drugs and more of a war on the people who people thought used drugs. Alright, so quick note here about the Southern Strategy. I'm not just making this up. This is sound, brilliant strategy. And it's also well documented that this is true. Take the words of one of Nixon's domestic strategists in an interview that he gave in 1994. In that interview, John Ehrlichman said that the campaign had two identified enemies. Quote, the anti-war left and blacks. Now I'm going to read a quote from this man. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So what's important to note is that these policies laid down by LBJ and Nixon didn't immediately lead to an explosion in our prison population. And actually, the federal prison population saw a slight decrease in the number of people that it held in 1970. According to the Bureau of Prisons, they held a little bit more than 22,000 people at the time. The first period of hyper-growth in that prison population will come in the next decade. But the way that I look at it is this. LBJ and Nixon laid down the gunpowder that led to the keg, and that keg was finna explode in the 80s. The saddest thing about this is that these two guys could have chosen to de-escalate racial tensions in the country, but they chose not to. They chose to allow their racist ideology to pervade their policy. And we're living with the effects of that today. So after Nixon resigned, the Republican Gerald Ford took office. And then the Democrat Jimmy Carter took office. Eventually, a humorous former Hollywood actor began battling the incumbent Jimmy Carter for the presidency. Ronald Reagan was tough on crime. And of course, crime did mean crime, but it also meant something else. Ronald Reagan won the presidency. He touted this trickle-down theory of economics, which he was convinced would help lift people out of poverty. Meanwhile, he and his administration were incarcerating people living in poverty at rates that would make your head spin. Black and brown people were, of course, the hardest hit. So now we're in the 80s. And from a population standpoint, a numbers standpoint, this is when we really start to see the beginning of mass incarceration. This is the decade we start to see the effects of all of the tough on crime policies that were laid in the decades before. From 1980 to 1990, we see our prison population practically double, from something like 350,000 people to something like 600,000 people at any given time. More people were being arrested, more people were being charged with low-level felonies, and more people were getting longer sentences. But the most psychologically destructive contributor to mass incarceration in the 80s came when Ronald Reagan decided to dust off an old Law and Order playbook for a new era of enforcement. On October 14, 1982, Ronald Reagan's administration decided to recommit itself to the war on crime, the same war that Nixon had waged 2 decades earlier. That effectively made the US's war on drugs longer than any other war that it had fought, including Vietnam. But there was a certain distinction between Reagan's war on drugs and Nixon's. Reagan's war on drugs focused primarily on one type of drug, crack cocaine. But one of the similarities between the two campaigns was that this was really a war on the people who people thought used that drug. As you know, phrases like war on crime and war on drugs are really euphemisms. They're a form of racism in the fine print. That fine print allows people to claim that they're fighting a war against one thing, although they're inflicting the damage on another thing. So while they claim to be fighting the crack epidemic, they were really inflicting damage on black, brown, and poor communities, but especially black communities. At that time, basically everybody used drugs at the same rate. It didn't really matter what color you were. But black and brown people were arrested at rates far higher than their white counterparts. And when black and brown people were sentenced, they usually received longer sentences than their white counterparts on average. And one of the reasons the sentences were longer was because black and brown people were more often getting found with crack cocaine, not the powder cocaine that many of their white counterparts used. Get caught with rock in the 80s and your sentence would be literally 100 times longer than if you were caught with the same amount of dust. You see, crack cocaine is cheaper than powder cocaine because it's mixed with cheaper materials. And because it was cheaper, it was found more often in lower income communities. What's wild is that at that time, few people really thought that drugs were an imminent threat to our country when Reagan doubled back down on the war. Our general attention was turned towards a host of other topics at the time, including increased racial tensions. But the fact that we were focused on other topics at that time did not stop Nancy Reagan from spearheading a probably well-intentioned but definitely ignorantly executed Just Say No campaign. The Just Say No campaign was ostensibly designed to empower kids to just say no to drugs. But the Just Say No campaign actually turned a public health issue into a moral issue, oversimplified the complex nature of drug use, disregarded the science of how drugs affect the body, stigmatized people with addiction, ignored how our societal structures were unable and under-equipped to support people with drug addiction, painted drug users as indefinite and irreparable criminals, used fear-based messaging to drive this criminal behavior underground, which justified more militant policing practices to find these criminals. That's an LBJ legacy, remember? And called for the long-term incarceration of these people who apparently had no morals. In hindsight, it's apparent that the Just Say No campaign didn't really empower kids at all. Instead, it empowered outside observers to just say no to the idea that black and brown kids were actually victims of drugs, not the other way around. So while a wealthy white woman messaged a ton of black and brown kids, aka the super predators of the 90s, into a corner, her hubby's administration started pouring salt in the wounds of our communities, just like the one I'm standing in now. You see, Ronnie and his squad were funneling money and military resources to groups in Central America who were known to be trafficking cocaine into the US, into neighborhoods like this. So I guess cocaine's alright if you're also fighting communists. He also signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 into being. This piece of legislation had a profound impact on our communities and ultimately a profound impact on our prison population. Part of this act was called the Armed Career Criminal Act. This thing enhanced punishments for possessions of firearms among felons. These enhanced penalties, minimum of 15 years with an implied maximum of life. The bigger act also included something called the Sentencing Reform Act. One of the things that this thing did was abolish federal parole. And I'm standing out here sweating. It might be easy to think that sweeping legislative changes like this happen in the dark part of our government, without our knowledge. And sometimes that's true. But in this case, these intense policy overhauls happened in full public view, and in many cases with full public approval. Thanks to a media hysteria and a relentless messaging campaign throughout the 80s, the crack epidemic became one of the top news items of the decade. Day after day and night after night, black and brown communities were dismantled in front of viewers, one image at a time. Mothers with addictions were portrayed as villains, and their babies stamped from the beginning as crack babies. The crack epidemic was a moral epidemic in these communities, according to the court of public opinion, not as the public health problem that it was, one that affects us all regardless of what neighborhood you live in. And again, the sad thing is that Reagan's administration could have theoretically done something to right these wrongs, but generally, they decided to do the opposite. In 1985, the administration hired staffers to publicize the emergence of crack cocaine in these neighborhoods, stoking the flames of what would eventually burn hundreds of thousands of people in these communities by the time he left office in 1989. Now, in 1988, polls showed that many Americans thought that drug use was a top problem in the country. What was a non-issue at the beginning of the decade was now a top issue in many people's minds. From the perspective of mass incarceration, I really wish that I could tell you that things healed and got better after Reagan left office. But the truth is that things were about to get a lot worse. There was a presidential race at the end of the decade. Michael Dukakis was a governor from the state of Massachusetts. He was also the Democratic nominee for president. At one point, he held a double-digit lead over his opponent, George H.W. Bush, who was the Republican nominee. Then it all fell apart for Dukakis. Now, Bush's campaign was brilliant in a twisted way. They launched a series of highly effective attack ads on Dukakis, and Dukakis could never really recover. These attack ads were crafted to evoke fear in the hearts and minds of viewers that if they elected the reform-minded Dukakis, then they would not be safe anywhere, including in their own homes. Like the ad about Willie Horton, which, side note, before we get into this, Willie Horton later said that he's never actually gone by Willie Horton. He'd always gone by William, but Bush administration, you gotta do what you gotta do. All right, so let me just read this script from the ad for you. Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton was given 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime. Now, throughout that ad, of course, they would show headshots of Bush when they say his name, Dukakis when they say his, but the most prominent face on that was Willie Horton's, who was, of course, a black man. Dukakis lost the election, and he later said that one of his biggest regrets was that he didn't fight back harder against those attack ads. Now, this failed election taught the Democratic Party a lesson. It taught them that their next candidate needed to be undeniably tough on crime, even tougher than his Republican counterparts. They finally found a perfect candidate for this in a young governor from Arkansas named William Clinton. But that would come in the 90s. The 80s finally ended, but not before inflicting irreparable damage on hundreds of thousands of people in these communities who are now caught up in the system of mass incarceration. Now, what do you think we can do to lower the prison population and decarcerate the U.S.? What do you think we need to improve on with our criminal justice system to make it a little bit more fair and just and restorative? Let me know in the comments below.